All right, welcome everyone. We're a little bit after 10, so 10 Pacific. So I will get started. And then as people join the meeting, I'll continue to let them in. But thank you very much for joining our April webinar for the Beads Journal of the Society of Bead Researchers. Before I introduce our speaker today, I did want to mention our journal with Dr. Elliot Blair. There we go. I did want to make sure that you're aware of our journal and the society, so I have a little bit of introduction here. We are hoping to do semi-regular webinars related to content in the journal. So we had one previously by Lars Larson, who has an article in the current issue of Beads, volume 36. Unfortunately, that one was not recorded, but today's presentation will be recorded. And we are working on shifting to a new journal hosting platform. So our Beads webpage is being updated. We have almost all of the archives online and freely available, and you can access them by going to beadresearchjournal.org. Current members can get access to the most current issue that will become open access at the end of this year. I also want to mention that if you are not a member of the Society of Bead Researchers, we encourage you to join. In addition to having access to the journal, we also have a newsletter, and we also have opportunities for student conference and travel awards and research funds. So if you are a bead researcher, we do have some funds available to support that. It is only $25 annually to get access to become a member and get access to our publications and be eligible for these awards. So you can go to beadresearch.org and then click on the membership link at the top of the page, and that will take you to a form where you can sign up and pay to join the Society of Bead Researchers. All right, so I just want to mention again that this webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting it online for later viewing. If you're here now, I will send a link to the recording, so if you have to leave or you want to watch it again, and then we'll make sure that these links are posted on the beadresearch.org, the webpage for the Society of Bead Researchers, and also the beadresearchjournal.org, which is the journal website specifically. Okay, so for now, I will introduce our speaker today, who is Dr. Elliot Blair, who is an associate professor in the anthropology department at the University of Alabama and also the president of our Society of Bead Researchers. He has a research focus on the colonial and late Mississippian periods of the southeastern United States, and as part of that has done a lot of work on glass beads, including glass beads on the island on St. Catherine's Island, glass bead research using portable X-ray fluorescence, PXRF. And today he's going to be specifically talking about this new publication on the glass trade beads of California. This is a document or a work by an archaeologist named Clement Meighan who had not published it. And so he worked with I guess the estate or the widow of Clement Meighan to put together this publication and adding additional information about the beads. And it's a really amazing resource for archaeologists working in North America and especially in California and on the West Coast. So I asked him here today to talk a little bit about this publication and also to tell us a little bit about the importance of this work and then some of the ethical issues related to publishing this as well too. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand this over to Dr. Elliot Blair. All right.
Allison, let me see if I can figure out how to this. How's that look? Does that look good there? All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Allison. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about Clement Meighan's glass trade beads in California. This is a publication that has been a long time in process. As I'll mention as I get into the talk, Clement Meighan started working on this project in 1949, and we just published it in 2024. And I started working on the project in 2014. So Clem started it 75 years ago, and I've been working at it for 10 years trying to bring it to publication. So it's been a very, very long time in the works. And as Allison said, my research, I work in the southeastern U.S., not that much in California. So I want to begin with sort of like a little introduction, how I got into this project. So going way back, I've been studying glass beads in archaeological contexts for 20 years now. And this began shortly after I finished my undergraduate work. I had the incredible good fortune to be hired by David Hurst Thomas and Laurie Pendleton at the American Museum of Natural History to work in the North American Archaeology Lab. And the big project that they had going on at the time was working on St. Catherine's Island, which was the site of Mission Santa Catalina de Wally, 17th century Spanish mission. And this was back in 2005 when I was hired, and I was given the assignment to try to work with the late Peter Francis's notes and manuscripts and the archaeological collections of more than 70,000 glass beads that were recovered from the site, and try to get this project published. And so I spent a couple of years working very closely with Laurie Pendleton, and we eventually published this monograph on the beads from St. Catherine's Island. As this project was wrapping up, I decided to go back to graduate school and went to the University of California at Berkeley, where I immediately started looking around for new bead projects to work on. And as luck would have it, my advisor at Berkeley, Kent Lightfoot, who'd done years of incredible work at Fort Ross, a Russian colonial site in California. And he asked me to look at some of the glass beads from Fort Ross. And so as I started diving into the glass beads of California, I kept coming across this reference to a manuscript called Glass Trade Beads in California by Clement Meighan. And I couldn't find a copy. I asked everyone I could think of, anyone I could find who had published on beads in California. I couldn't find any record of it. Nobody had a copy. And I looked into this manuscript a little bit more, which was completely unavailable, and I found out a little bit more about it. So Clem Meighan, a very famous California archaeologist, he was a professor at UCLA for most of his career, but he began assembling a type collection of all of the different varieties of glass trade beads in California, starting in 1949. This is when he was an undergraduate at Berkeley. He continued working on this for decades throughout his graduate work at Berkeley, and then as he was a professor at UCLA. He attempted to publish the manuscript several times during his lifetime, but he was never, able to successfully get it published. But despite this, it was used in numerous early reports to classify archaeological beads assemblages in California, and there's sort of countless references to this manuscript with a wide variety of dates, undated manuscript, lots of sort of random dates, but impossible to find a copy of. And so after a couple of years of looking for it, I gave up. I thought it didn't exist. I was out of luck. And then one day in 2014, I got an email from Keith Johnson. He's a professor emeritus from Chico State in California. He was a student of Clem Meighan's and close friends with Clem's wife, Joan Meighan. And Joan and Keith were really interested in seeing, after all these years, if maybe Clem's manuscript could finally be published. And they reached out to my advisor in grad school, Kent Lightfoot, asking him, if he knew anybody interested in beads, who'd be familiar with the California bead assemblages. And lucky for me, they put Keith and Joan in touch with me. And at long last, they sent me a copy of Clem's manuscript. Um, you know, Typewritten, photocopied, nothing electronic. And I reviewed the manuscript and I highly recommended publication. Something, that was, worked on decades ago. It was, a little bit dated, but it was incredibly important for California archaeology. Just the documentation of types, some of the work on distributions of types in California, and also as a source to decode a lot of early reports that used Meighan's typology. And as I'll talk a little bit, his typology was, he didn't use the kid and kid typology system that most archaeologists are familiar with. He just numbered the bead varieties that he encountered sequentially. So when you looked at these old reports in California, you'd see, Meighan type 5. What does that mean? Nobody really knew. So Joan and Keith, asked me if I would take the lead in trying to get Clem's manuscript edited and ready for publication, and I enthusiastically agreed to work on this project. One thing that I quickly, after looking at the manuscript, I decided, it needed to be reviewed, going back to the, to the original collection. And the original type collection, housed at the Hearst Museum at the University of California. And so I reached out to the museum, and in 2016, they allowed me to come and spend a few days working with the museum collection, looking at the archives, the documents, and the actual type collection that Meighan had assembled. And so what you're looking at here, this is one of the original record forms that Meighan recorded. This one from May 12th, 1949, type number 1. This is his original documentation form. And in association with these forms that Meighan had documented, there also was a set of cards. And so these were sort of index cards with bead type numbers and the actual physical specimen that Meighan had collected wired to the card for reference purposes. So I spent a bunch of time, looking through the collection, thinking about this, and it became pretty quickly that there were a number of issues with Meighan's original analysis that needed to be addressed in order to bring the project to publication. So some of these problems and challenges. When Meighan was doing this work, method of manufacture was almost never recorded. Now, we're routinely used to looking at beads and identifying whether they're drawn, wound, mold pressed, blown. Meighan didn't think this was, usually discernible, and so he almost never recorded this. He also had a very unusual approach to classification, whereas most bead typological systems, the kid and kid system, for example, rely on bead method of manufacture as the primary sorting criteria. Meighan used color as the primary sorting. So, first you determine if the bead was, blue or red or green, rather than determining whether it was drawn or wound or blown. So sort of an unusual approach to classification. He also only used very basic color categories. So, it would just be blue. And so, is it cobalt blue or turquoise blue? He didn't parse it beyond these very basic color categories. There was so the images that he'd taken, back in the 1980s and 1990s were a fairly low resolution. Typically, some of these examples here, there are often shadows in the images. Beads would only be shown from one perspective. You wouldn't see both the profile and the cross section of them. And many times the photographs had faded to pink. So there was so a lot of work needed to be done with imaging of these beads. And he also had paid little attention to manufacturing source. And of course, back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, we didn't have a great handle on where a lot of these beads might have been being manufactured. And so a lot has changed. So when I went to do my analysis, I reanalyzed the entire collection, documenting method of manufacture, drawn, wound, mold pressed, etc. I documented color using the Munsell bead color book. And then the Hearst Museum of Anthropology very kindly took high resolution digital photographs of the entire collection. So here's some of the examples. This is that type 1 bead that Meighan documented. and some of the Hearst Museum images. And many of these images are available online at the Hearst Museum website. I also paid close attention to location and manufacture for many of the varieties in his assemblage. Looking at, there have been lots of sample cards that have been published in the years since Meighan originally assembled the type collection. And so, yeah, so looking at color, trying to assemble better images, identifying method of manufacture, and then really paying close attention to manufacturing source is what I was looking at in my analysis, my reanalysis of his collection. So then producing this new edited manuscript based on the documents I'd provided and my new reanalysis, there was a lot to sort of think about how to do this in a way that updated the original manuscript, but also maintained fidelity to Meighan's original work. I didn't want to rewrite his publication. This is something that had been extensively cited in draft form, even though it was almost impossible to attain. It had been heavily cited in the past, and for historical reasons, getting his original manuscript out was was incredibly important. So what I opted to do is I annotated his manuscript using footnotes. And so, even when, if he said something that, we now know to be incorrect, or there were new references that should be cited, I added this material to his manuscript through footnotes. So it was very clear what was Meighan's, original interpretations and analysis versus what, I was adding to the text. I also wrote a new introduction to the volume, trying to talk about this process, this history of working with this collection, this process of bringing it to publication, and address sort of synthesizing a little bit about what what was apparent in the collection. I also needed to find a publisher. Originally, I really wanted to publish this through the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley through their contribution series. I thought this was, perhaps the most appropriate venue to publishing it. It was open access. The collection was housed at UC Berkeley. Meighan had received both his undergraduate and graduate degrees at Berkeley, and I thought this would, really be the best place to publish it. But as we go through this, that ended up not working out for a number of reasons. And then I also needed to assemble new composite color plates. When Meighan first put it together and was attempting to publish the manuscript, color plates and illustrations was one of the major challenges that he faced. This was before digital images, wide color image publication. He just really didn't have a good solution to illustrating 440 different bead varieties in color. His original plan had been to use microfiche inserts, which no longer needed to do that. So I needed to assemble color plates for the publication. And as I'm going to detail here, this ended up being quite a interesting process, and it actually resulted, I ended up having to abandon publishing through the Archaeological Research Facility and ultimately published it through British Archaeological Reports, BAR International, which is a large, publisher of archaeological reports and monographs, very invested in publishing these very heavy data-rich volumes. So, but now I'm going to talk a little bit about the color plates, because this was, the biggest challenge, perhaps the biggest hurdle to getting this manuscript to press. So, as I mentioned, the Hearst Museum photographed every bead in the collection for me. And I began by assembling composite color plates to illustrate all of these. And you can see here, this is a portion of one of these that I began compiling. And you'll notice it's very fragmentary. I've redacted quite a lot of it. And all of the images that are redacted are ones that were clearly photographs of funerary objects. And so when I first began this process, I wasn't paying very close attention to the provenience of the beads in this collection. This was a type collection. I was, documenting the varieties that Meighan had documented. And for, these purposes, it wasn't critical, what precise sites or contexts the beads were coming from. And in some cases, the Hearst Museum had already redacted images and access to these objects. You can see here, this is one of the original plates I put together, type 63. There was no image. The bead was from a burial context. The Hearst Museum had repatriated that object through NAGPRA, and the the and so I was opting to leave this as a blank space in the color plate. As I started to look into the context of these beads a little bit more, it soon became clear to me that far more beads in the assemblage than what had already been redacted were actually coming from burial contexts. And so in this image, the only beads shown here, these are beads that were, these were non-archaeological samples. These were from ethnographic collections that Meighan pulled together. But many of the other beads from his type collection were either clearly from burials, or the provenience context was so limited that there was really no way to be sure where the where the bead that he was including in his collection had actually come from. And for those of you who are archaeologists, you're certainly very familiar with NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which required that human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, objects of cultural patrimony be repatriated to tribal nations. And in the last few years, with NAGPRA, there's sort of been a renewed focus on repatriation and ethically depicting objects from funerary contexts. And you can see here, this image is sort of showing some of the institutions, some of the locations where Native American funerary objects and human remains, ancestral remains, are still residing in museum collections and have not yet been repatriated. And you can see here, California is one of those locations where there are lots of ancestral remains that have not been repatriated. So as I was looking to publish this, this manuscript, and sort of realizing that far more of the collection was funerary than I had understood, or it was impossible to tell because of the lack of good documentation. I was really thinking about, in the context of NAGPRA and CalNAGPRA, how can I ethically publish the Meighan type collection in a way that we're complying with the letter and the spirit of the law. We certainly don't want to illustrate any any photographs of funerary objects, and we want to but also still document the collection in a way that allows it to be useful to researchers. So sort of thinking through this process with the Archaeological Research Facility and the press, and sort of thinking like what are the options we have here to publish this image, this document, this manuscript with images. And so one option, of course, would be to consult with tribal nations on every image in the collection. And there's more than 200 federally recognized tribes and states in California. And there were 1,000+ images that I used in creating the original colored plates. So this, both logistically, consulting, with this many tribes and this many images, isn't really feasible. And also at the same time, almost certainly, it's, permission to use photographs of funerary objects, wouldn't be coming. And I could talk to, some tribal members and TIPO offices, and it was very clear that using photographic images of funerary objects was, not something that, anyone would support. So another option, we could publish it omitting all possible images of funerary objects. And so, I could have sought images of bead types from alternative locations, or just left out images of any that might potentially be funerary. Um, but this would have we're publishing the volume without images, but this would have without images, a bead type catalog isn't terribly useful. Beads, images are pretty essential to well document a collection. So I started to think, where maybe perhaps there were some creative alternatives. How could we document the range of types in the collection, but not include photographic images of these funerary objects? And I decided to pursue archaeological illustrations. And I found an illustrator actually in Spain, um, Marina Lezcano, who created these are pen and ink and watercolor images of all of the different varieties in the Meighan collection. And so she did these illustrations. These were using images that were publicly available on the Hearst Museum website, using examples from bead sample cards. I showed some of those publications, the covers of some of those publications earlier on. Lots of sample cards from the manufacturers are available. And so with reference to those sample cards, she was able to illustrate some of the beads. And then there's a number of other publications, such as, some of the publications from Fort Vancouver, which illustrate many photographs of many of the similar types. And so sort of pulling from all of these different resources, she was able to create these these illustrations of bead types. These are not depictions of specific objects from specific archaeological objects, but rather these are bead varieties. So you can see each one numbered with Meighan's bead variety number, bead number 209. So these are composite images of what each of these types look like. And so I really think she did a really fantastic job illustrating these images. And we were able to successfully avoid no photographs of funerary objects, but still being able to illustrate all of the different varieties in the collection in a way that would make them useful to researchers. So we really felt that this was a good solution to documenting the collection in an ethical way, and in a way that would still be useful for future research. Yeah, so it's these 10 color bead plates. Yeah, it was, and I was actually fortunate when I pivoted from doing the photographic plates to switching to illustrations. I was very fortunate that I had two grants, one from the Bead Society of Los Angeles and one from the Portland Bead Society. And originally these funds had been, they had been earmarked for paying for photographic reproduction permission fees from the Hearst Museum. But when I pivoted, those funds were able to use to pay the illustrator to illustrate all of these beads, and it worked out quite nicely. At the same time, this illustration process, this is something that I sort of talked about with the UC Berkeley Press, and we sort of worked out that this would be a acceptable solution. But as we move closer to publication, after the illustrations were finished, it really became apparent that the press wasn't going to be willing to go forward with publishing these images. It was, and I'll confess, it was a little frustrating because the actual photographic images of many of these types were still publicly available on the Hearst Museum website. And we were no longer using any of these photographs, but they weren't willing to publish the illustrations. So I ended up reaching out to British Archaeological Reports and working with them, and it was a very smooth, easy process. And I think we ended up with a nice product. Yeah, one of my biggest regrets, however, is Clement Meighan's widow, Joan. She passed away, about a year before we were finally able to get this published. I'd been working on it for 10 years, trying to get it out. And yeah, Joan unfortunately passed away just before it was completed. So that was, yeah, I regret that. Um, just a little bit about the actual collection. In Meehan's collection, there ended up being 440 different varieties that he documented. Actually, two of these ended up being fluorite beads. They weren't glass. But here's just sort of the breakdown of the varieties in his collection. And there's certainly more varieties in California that have been documented since since Meehan assembled the type collection. But I didn't put any effort into documenting new varieties that had been found in California or updating his distribution lists that he'd put together at the time. I sort of cut it off where he had finished. Um, the other thing that I sort of want to point out here, just sort of looking at the collection that he documented, there's quite a variety of bead sources present in his collection. Venice, of course, Bohemia, probably Briar, Lachtal, Germany, possibly China and Bavaria. So it's a pretty extensive network of manufacturing locations where these varieties are coming from. And yeah, and as I said, we finally got it published in 2024. I'd been working on it for 10 years, 75 years after Meehan had originally started documenting the collection. I think it's a really I think it's a really important book historically for studying glass beads in California and Western North America and in 18th, 19th, 20th century contexts worldwide. And with such a long process, there's lots of people who helped out in innumerable ways, getting this to press. And so thanks to all of these folks for support and funding. And yeah, and that's sort of the story behind this, how I got involved, how we got it to publication, and how we got it to press. And I'd be happy to take questions and chat about any aspect of this. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Elliot. That was really fascinating. I'm just going to point out again, if you would like to ask questions, you should be able to see a Q&A box, and you can drop your Q&A, your questions in there for us to answer, or use the chat box as well. While people are maybe putting together their thoughts about or any questions that they have, I did have a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you, Elliot. One is, do you have I mean, there's like an amazing amount of possible like original source locations for the beads. Would these all have been funneled through the missions in California and then disseminated to Native American communities from there? Or how were Native American people getting these beads?
So some would certainly be through the missions, but a lot of this collection is probably post mission um, collections, and so this would be sort of networks through Fort Vancouver and um, um, oh, I'm blanking on it right now. What it is um, the Hudson Bay Company trade. I don't know why I blanked out on that for a minute, but yeah, Hudson Bay Company trade. And so this, I mean, he tried to be, try to be pretty comprehensive in where he was finding the glass beads. So it's certainly a pretty good representation of what would have been coming through the missions, but it's far beyond that. And lots of these are later Hudson Bay Company products.
All right, that's really interesting. Another question I had was, as you were going through this collection, did you find any bead types that you hadn't seen before? Or did like the process of going through all this data shift some of your own research or thinking about bead trade in North America?
Yeah, um, yeah, certainly, yes. There's certainly quite a few that I hadn't seen before. Certainly hadn't seen before. Personally in my examination of beads, a very different kind of collection than the 17th century southeastern material, 16th and 17th century southeastern material I was most used to. This 18th, 19th century kind of material, very different. So, it was a little bit of a learning curve, with looking at these materials. And yeah, certainly some of these later types. And yeah, there's still, there's a number of sort of unusual varieties in his collection that, there aren't really great parallels to. So there's certainly some mysteries in there that, yeah, I don't quite know what to make of them or where they might be coming from.
Great. I haven't seen any questions pop up yet. I'll also mention, I think you should be able to unmute if anyone wanted to unmute. And let's see, I see Kate has raised her hand. Kate, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hey, thanks. So one thing was I was just going to note that my chat seems like it's disabled. I don't know if that's true for others as well.
Oh,
So
okay.
that might be why you're not getting chats. Thanks, Elliot. This was great. And congratulations on the monumental effort. I think your illustrations are gorgeous, and I think it's a great solution for this kind of project, especially because you're thinking about it as a type study. So two questions. One, can you say the name of your illustrator again, or maybe put it in the chat so that we can all steal them? And second, I'm wondering if you did consult with any tribes on that solution, about whether they thought it was an appropriate solution, and how they responded.
Yeah. So first, her name's Marina Lezcano. I'll put a link to her website in the chat for everybody here. Because yeah, she was great to work with. It was yeah, she was fantastic. Very fast. It's affordable. Yeah, she was great. And yeah, so when I spoke to some of the tribes and started reaching out, I mean, it was very clear that there was no enthusiasm for, photographs. That was out. And then when I started talking about illustrations, yeah, everybody, I didn't go and ask specifically for permission for illustrating types. I wasn't actually sure how to, how would you feel about illustrating a type 7 bead that, an example has come from a funerary context in, your tribal area. So it's sort of a difficult, question. I wasn't sure exactly how to approach, or what kind of permission I would be asking for. But the feedback I've gotten is some appreciation for not using funerary for not using funerary images, and yeah, and moving to sort of these conceptualized type images rather than depicting specific objects.
Thanks. I think I fixed the chat box issue. I do have a question in the Q&A box, and then two people have raised their hands. So I'll do the Q&A box question first and then get to the people who've raised their hands. So the question is, are beads determined to be related to burial because of the location where they are found? In other words, found at a gravesite, or are there beads that were just used for burial?
With these, it's a whole variety. There are certainly some, where if you go back to the original field notes, it'll say, from a specific burial. And certainly, a lot of these collections that Meighan was working from, dating, he started when he started this in the 40s. A lot of these large collections were certainly, large cemetery sites that had been excavated, though many lacked good provenience. And yeah, so some it's impossible to know what the context of them was. Those many, if you go back and look at the original, the sample cards that he assembled of his locational data, there are very many contexts that are listed very specifically as burial or from specific burial contexts.
Great, thanks. Michelle, you have a question.
Yeah, I don't know how My question was, are there other studies, or where else has the Meighan typology been applied? I'm specifically thinking of the Fort Vancouver collection. Is this something that you would use to analyze other assemblages or collections on the West Coast? And where else would you use it?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily begin with the Meighan framework to do any new analysis. For West Coast beads, I think it's I would look use the Kid and Kid system as expanded by Carlos Carclin's, and then a lot of Lester Ross's work is really good for looking at West Coast beads. The real value I think in the Meighan collection is a lot of older analyses of California collections used his system. And so you'll find these older reports that list Meighan type 180, and sort of you can use this to decode what those mean. And also since part of what I did is I included a concordance between Meighan's type numbers and these Kid and Kid systems. It makes it a little bit easier to do cross-site comparisons from older collections to newer collections, newer analyses.
Great. And Wendy, you had your hand raised also.
Hi there. It's great to see your work and what you've done. I know it wasn't easy, but it would be really nice to know, like, are you planning to have a follow-up? Are you, thinking that you're gonna look at it with a new, fresh set of eyes, since you were saying that a lot of that work was outdated, the way that he had done it back in the past?
Yeah, I hadn't really I hadn't really thought about much new analysis. I haven't I'm only peripherally sort of involved in California archaeology, and so I hadn't planned to go back to some of these older reports and look at the analyses that have been done using his typology. And yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that could be done from this manuscript, looking at distributions and looking at some of the newer more recent analyses of beads from California that have been done. A lot that could be done going forward. It's not something that I'm personally planning to do. But I think there's a lot of potential for folks who are California archaeologists to pursue. Yeah, love to help folks who are interested in that, but it's not something I'm planning to work on going forward.
I'm gonna say it sounds like a great project for a grad student. If there's one out there. Michelle, did you have your hand raised again, or is that left over from your previous question?
Yeah, sorry, I don't even know why I couldn't figure out how to do it before, and now it's doing it twice. I don't know. Sorry.
Okay, I'll lower your hand. Lori, go ahead.
Thanks, Allison, and hello, Elliot. It's actually Laurie Burgess here. We've just corresponded. Hi. I just wanted to say what an amazing resource this is going to be for North American beads and California beads in general. And I think you've done it so artfully to make all the beads available to everyone in an ethical and sensible way. So I really think by making Meighan's collection available, you've really kind of given a gift now and to the future to the field, because it's such a major collection. So it was more of a comment than a question.
Well, thank you. And thanks for reviewing the manuscript early on for me. I appreciate that too.
Oh, it was fun to review.
Great. I was just going to see if anyone else has any other questions. They're welcome to put them in the chat or their Q&A or raise their hand. So as I mentioned earlier, I'll be posting a recording of this online, and then maybe I'll put a link to your BAR page if anyone's interested in purchasing a copy of this book for their own. And then maybe you can also put a link, we can add a link to your Illustrator as well too, so we can share some of these resources.
I did put that link in the chat there. Lezcano.com.
Okay, great.
Yep. But
Right.
she's fantastic to work with. Yeah, fantastic.
I was gonna say they're so beautiful. I mean, I would like get a print of that and frame it, have it framed and hanging in my office or something. They're really wonderful to see. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands or questions, so I think we can wrap up. But thank you so much, Elliot, for presenting this work and sharing this. There is a book review of this in our most current issue of the Beads Journal. And again, feel free to join if you're not already a member. And if you are, thank you very much. And thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. And I'll be sending out information on our next webinar when we have it all set up. So thank you.